Hospitals are never quiet. Even in the dead of night, there's a hum of machines, the faint shuffle of nurses' footsteps, and the occasional muffled cry from a patient's room. I should know. I work the night shift at St. Benedict's General, manning the front desk. It's a job that feels endless, but it pays the bills. Started like any other night. Around 11 p.m., the lobby was empty except for the usual smells of antiseptic and stale coffee. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, and I was half-heartedly scrolling through my phone when the automatic doors hissed open. I glanced up, expecting a late-night visitor or an emergency patient, but what I saw froze me in place. A woman stood in the doorway, pale as the fluorescent lights above her. She wore a thin hospital gown, the kind we give patients, but it was filthy, smeared with something dark, blood maybe. Her hair was wild, sticking out in matted clumps. But what unsettled me the most were her eyes. They were too wide, too dark, like they were absorbing the light around her. "Can I help you?" I stammered. She didn't answer. Instead, she started walking toward me, barefoot, her steps slow and deliberate. The click of the keyboard under my fingers felt deafening as I pretended to check the system for her name. "Are you here to visit someone?" I tried again, keeping my voice steady. She stopped a few feet from the desk, tilting her head like she was studying me. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Room 237. The air around me felt suddenly colder. Room 237 was empty. It had been for weeks, ever since the last patient, a young man who had overdosed, died there. I knew this for a fact because I'd been the one to process the paperwork. "There's no one in that room," I said, forcing a smile. "Are you sure you have the right hospital?" Her head tilted further, almost unnaturally so, and a faint smile tugged at her cracked lips. "He's waiting for me." Something about the way she said it made my skin crawl. Before I could reply, she turned and walked down the hallway leading to the patient rooms. I sat there, frozen, watching her figure disappear into the dimly lit corridor. My first instinct was to call security, but something stopped me. A strange, nagging feeling in the back of my mind whispered that it wouldn't matter. Instead, I grabbed the desk phone and dialed the night nurse on duty. "Hey, Monica," I said, keeping my voice low. "Did you see a woman in a hospital gown come through your floor?" There was a pause on the other end. "What are you talking about?" "A woman just walked past me. She said she was going to room 237. The silence stretched longer this time. "That's impossible. I've been here all night, and no one's come through. And room 237 is locked." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Can you check, please? Just humor me." I heard Monica sigh, followed by the faint sound of her shoes on the linoleum floor. A few seconds later, her voice came back, shaky this time. "The door's open." "What?" I shot up from my chair, heart pounding. "It's open," she repeated, her voice barely audible. "And I think someone's inside." "Don't go in," I said quickly. "I'll be right there." Grabbing my keycard, I hurried down the hallway, the fluorescent lights flickering as I passed under them. By the time I reached room 237, Monica was standing outside the door, her face pale. "I swear I locked it earlier," she whispered. I didn't respond. Instead, I pushed the door open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the heart monitor next to the bed. The bed itself was empty, but the sheets were rumpled, like someone had just been lying there. And then I saw her. The woman was standing in the far corner, her back to us. She was whispering something, her voice low and rhythmic. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound made my stomach churn. "Ma'am," I called out, my voice trembling. "You're not supposed to be here." She stopped whispering. Slowly, she turned to face us, her eyes locking onto mine. And then, in a voice that didn't belong to her, deep, guttural, and full of malice, she said, "He's not done yet." The lights flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness for a split second. When they came back on, she was gone. The room was empty. Monica and I didn't speak as we backed out of the room and closed the door. We didn't need to. Whatever that was, it wasn't human. I quit my job the next day. St. Benedict's can keep its ghosts. Hospitals never bothered me. As a night shift nurse in a small-town hospital, I'd grown used to their stillness. The long, dimly lit hallways, the hum of machines, the occasional distant wail of a siren. It was part of the job, or so I thought. Last week, my shift started like any other. I clocked in at 10 p.m., grabbed a coffee, and made my way to the third floor, where I was assigned to the general ward. The ward had only 6 patients that night, most of them stable and sleeping soundly. The quiet was comforting at first. Around midnight, I was organizing patient charts at the nurses' station when I noticed room 300 and SIX's call light blinking. That was odd. The room had been empty for 2 days. The last patient had been discharged. Figuring it was a technical glitch, I walked over to turn it off. The hallway leading to room 306 was unusually cold, the kind of cold that makes your breath visible. I checked the thermostat, but it read a normal 72 degrees Fahrenheit. Brushing it off, I entered the room. The air inside was heavy, almost suffocating. The bed was made, untouched since the last patient had left. Yet, the call button lay on the bed, as though someone had just pressed it. My stomach knotted. I reminded myself that it was probably a prank by one of the day shift nurses. With a nervous chuckle, I turned off the call light and walked out. At 2 a.m., I was making my rounds when I heard something. A faint, raspy whisper. "Help me." I froze. It came from room 306. My heart hammered against my ribs as I crept closer. The door was ajar, though I distinctly remembered closing it. Inside, the room was dark, except for the faint glow of the streetlight filtering through the blinds. "Is someone there?" I called out, my voice trembling. Silence. I stepped in, my flashlight sweeping across the room. Nothing. Just the empty bed and the faint smell of antiseptic. I turned to leave, but as I reached the door, I heard it again. Closer this time. "Help me." I spun around, the beam of my flashlight shaking. That's when I saw it. A figure sat on the bed, hunched over, its face buried in its hands. Its outline was faint, almost translucent, but unmistakable. My breath caught in my throat. Who are you?" I stammered. The figure slowly raised its head, revealing hollow, sunken eyes and a face twisted in anguish. "They left me," it rasped. "They let me die." Panic surged through me. I bolted from the room, my feet barely touching the ground. Back at the nurses' station, I grabbed my colleague, Maria, and dragged her to 306. "There's someone in there," I gasped. We entered together, but the room was empty. The bed was perfectly made, the call button resting neatly on the pillow. Maria gave me a concerned look. "You've been working too hard," she said gently. I wanted to believe her, but the events of the night were far from over. At 4 a.m., as the ward fell into its usual eerie stillness, the monitors in room 305, the room next to 306, began to blare. I rushed in to find Mr. Harris, a 78-year-old recovering from surgery, thrashing in his bed. "She's here!" he screamed, his eyes wild with terror. "She's sitting on my chest." I tried to calm him, but he grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. "Don't let her take me," he pleaded, tears streaming down his face. We sedated him, but his words left me shaken. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. By the time my shift ended at 6 a.m., I was exhausted. As I headed to the elevator, I glanced back at the ward one last time. The hallway was empty, but in the reflection of the glass door, I saw her, the figure from room 306, standing at the far end of the hallway, watching me. I didn't wait. I sprinted out of the hospital and didn't look back. I've swapped shifts since then, refusing to work on the 3rd floor. But every now and then, I hear the whispers, faint, distant, but unmistakable. And I know she's still there, waiting for someone to help her, or maybe to join her. It started on my first night shift as a trainee nurse in the old wing of St. Augustus Hospital, a section that had long been closed off to the public but was reopened temporarily due to the recent influx of patients. I was nervous but eager to prove myself. The senior nurse, Clara, handed me a clipboard and a flashlight. "The old wing can be unnerving," she said with a faint smirk. "Just stick to the basics. Check vitals, deliver meds, and don't wander too far." The old wing was nothing like the rest of the hospital. It smelled of mildew and decay, and the flickering fluorescent lights barely lit the peeling walls. Room 311 was my first stop. I knocked lightly before stepping in. The patient, an elderly man with hollow eyes, stared at me from his bed. His chart read, "Mr. Grayson." I introduced myself, but he didn't respond. His gaze didn't waver. As I approached to check his he rasped, "Don't go into room 316. I paused. "Why not?" He shook his head violently, gripping my wrist with surprising strength. "Promise me, don't go there." His voice was desperate, almost panicked. I forced a smile, trying to calm him. "I won't," I said, gently prying his fingers off my arm. As I turned to leave, he whispered something under his breath that sent a chill down my spine. "She's waiting." The rest of the patients were uneventful, mild coughs, low fevers, nothing out of the ordinary. But as the hours dragged on, the hallway grew quieter, and the oppressive silence began to gnaw at me. I couldn't shake Mr. Grayson's warning. By 2 a.m., I found myself standing outside room 316. The door was slightly ajar, and a cold draft seeped through the gap. I hesitated. Clara had specifically said not to wander, but curiosity got the better of me. The room was empty. No bed, no monitors, just a single wheelchair in the center of the room. The air felt heavier, and the faint scent of something metallic lingered. I was about to leave when I noticed a faint, wet trail leading from the wheelchair to the corner of the room. Against my better judgment, I followed the trail with my flashlight. The beam landed on a crumpled hospital gown, and next to it, a pair of bare, bloody footprints. My heart pounded as I scanned the room. It was empty, wasn't it? A soft humming broke the silence. I spun around, and my flashlight flickered, landing briefly on a figure standing in the doorway. It was a woman, her hospital gown tattered, her hair a mess of tangles, and her eyes empty like twin voids. She tilted her head, and the humming grew louder, almost like a lullaby. I backed away, my flashlight shaking in my hands. "Who are you?" I whispered. She stepped closer, her bare feet leaving fresh bloody prints on the floor. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice a distorted echo. I bolted for the door, but it slammed shut in front of me. The humming turned into a low, guttural growl. I pressed my back against the wall, heart racing. As she glided closer, her hollow eyes locked on mine. Suddenly, the door burst open, and Clara stormed in, her face pale as a sheet. She grabbed my arm and yanked me out of the room. "What were you thinking?" she hissed, slamming the door shut behind us. I saw someone in there," I stammered. Clara shook her head, her voice trembling. "There hasn't been anyone in room 316 for years. It's been closed since a patient hung herself there, an old woman who used to hum lullabies to herself. No one goes in there." I stared at her, my mind reeling. The blood, the footprints, the woman. How could she explain that? Clara must have seen the fear in my eyes because she sighed and said, "Welcome to the night ward. Some things you're better off not understanding." I never worked the old wing again, but every now and then, when I pass by the closed door of room 316, I swear I hear a faint humming, and I wonder if she's still waiting for me or for someone else foolish enough to step inside.